Hello, so welcome to the first topic of Year 13. So we are going to start our Year 13 studies with investigating populations. Now this topic is made up of two sections. We've got ecosystems, which if you turn now into your keynotes and you have a look at the specification snip, you can see that as it opens up, it says populations of different species form a community and the non-living components of its environment together form an ecosystem, and ecosystems can range in size from being very small to very large. So the first section of this topic is all about ecosystems, and you can see that it follows with all the things that make up that ecosystem. So we've got the habitat, species, niche, abiotic and biotic conditions. So lots of new key terminology that we will need to be able to define. Okay, and then it sort of goes into greater depth, thinking about populations and population sizes and what limits them. So we talk about carrying capacity and the things that limit a population size within an ecosystem. So for example, abiotic factors or biotic factors such as competition and predation. Okay, then the second part of this topic really is about studying populations. So it's impossible for a scientist to go to an ecosystem for the majority of cases and count all the individuals of a particular species present, and if they want to investigate a community, they would have to measure the population sizes of lots of different species, and to actually count every single individual of every single species would take far too long. Okay, so scientists need to develop ways of sampling populations so that they can make good, reliable population estimates. Okay, so that they can study the size of populations and whether they change over time and how they compare to the populations of other species. So to be able to do that, we will learn about three different methodologies. Okay, two you're already super familiar with from your GCSE studies. So as you can see from your spec, we'll be looking at how we can estimate the size of a population using randomly placed quadrats. Okay, so I know you've done that one at school. And also quadrats that are placed along a belt transect or an interrupted belt transect. Okay, now they are methods that we use to investigate population sizes and also the distribution of species within an ecosystem if they are not mobile. Okay, so usually plants or barnacles or snails. We have a third method, which you won't have studied at GCSE, which is called the mark release recapture method, which we're going to teach you about, which we use for animal population studies. Okay, so that's an overview of the topic. We're going to move forward, continuing straight into your keynotes where it says ecology there. Okay, and today in this video we're going to concentrate on the 7 ecological key terms. Okay, so you've seen those within the specification as we read through. The ecosystem, population, community, habitat, niche, abiotic factors and biotic factors. Now, as we learn all the definitions and explore those, we want to then enable you to see how the examiner will assess you on those key terms. Okay, so that will mainly be in paper 2 of next year. And then once you understand abiotic and biotic factors, can you apply that knowledge to explain data sets on the distribution of organisms within an ecosystem? And then finally, my favourite type of question. This is all about the key term niche. Explain why 2 species of an organism don't occupy the same niche. Okay, so let's explore our first key term, ecosystem. So if you look in your keynotes, Ecology is the study of ecosystems. Okay, so these are the organisms and the environment in which they live, the way they interrelate with each other, and the elements of the environment are also considered. So what is an ecosystem? Well, in the grey box, you've got a good definition. It's a community of interacting organisms, so they're different species, living together in that habitat. And they also interact with the physical environment. So a good example of this might be a plant. Say it loses its leaves and they drop to the floor. Those nitrates, as you know from your GCSEs, will be returned to the soil. So the nitrogen within the plant will be returned to the soil in a form of nitrates, and then they'll be taken up by other plants. So there's an interaction between the environment and the organisms as well. So an ecosystem is made up of interacting biotic and abiotic features, okay, in one particular area. So that's a different definition, but you can see the elements are still there. So we've got in there the idea of our biotics, our community of interacting organisms, and the abiotics, the physical environment. Okay. Right, so let's explore some examples. Our first one is the rainforest. Okay, so let's have a look at the rainforest picture and think about why it's an ecosystem. So it's got lots of different plant species we can see, and of course they will be habitats and niches for lots of different animal species with lots of different interacting species. Some of the plants will be food sources for the herbivores, some of the herbivores will be food sources for the carnivores, so we'll have feeding relationships, we might have competitors. So we've got an interaction between the living organisms, and then of course they're going to interact with the physical environment as well. And we can think of lots of factors that might affect the organisms, like oxygen concentration in the water, light intensity if you're a plant species, under the canopy. So lots of interaction there between the physical environment and the organisms, but of course the organisms in the other way interact with the environment. So for example, the trees are photosynthesizing and releasing oxygen, taking carbon dioxide out of the environment. So there's a way in which they're physically changing the physical environment. All right, so remember, we've got both interacting organisms within the community, so the living factors, the biotic factors, and the abiotic factors, the physical environment that they interact with, all of which is your ecosystem. And there are lots of examples. So let's have a look. Every single one of these fulfills. Okay, even if you have to be very specially adapted to live there, there are still communities of plants and animals in a desert. Okay, so there may be xerophytes and specially adapted animals too, but and it might not be as diverse an ecosystem as our rainforest, but it is still an ecosystem. Okay, so a community of plants and animals living together and they're interacting with the physical environment. Same for a pond. So even though it's very small, much smaller than the other two that we've looked at, a pond is still an ecosystem. And you can see that we've got plants and animals interacting with each other in the pond. And we've also got our physical factors that we can see, our water. We could imagine our water concentration, temperature, all these factors that would be also making up our ecosystem. A few more to consider. Okay, so you might be a scientist who is sent to study an ecosystem. So you might go to study the tidal region, one of our tidal regions, maybe where there's an estuary and a sand dune, like in this picture here. When you go to study that tidal region, if you're an ecologist, you would be studying the ecosystem. So what kind of things would you measure? Well, you'd measure the population sizes of plants and animal species in that ecosystem, but you'd also take lots of physical measurements, things like wind speed, soil temperature, soil water availability, etc. Okay, so studying an ecosystem means you study both the biotic and the abiotic factors that make it up. Other examples? Farmer's field. Now you might think, oh, yeah, Well, it's not natural ecosystem. Well, it's an ecosystem, okay? Think back to your definition. So even though the farmer has planted the crop and it's a monoculture, so that means the diversity in this ecosystem will be lower than maybe a natural ecosystem. We've still got different plant species present, we've got different animal species present, they're interacting with each other and they're interacting with the physical environment. Okay, and again, you can have really what looks like barren, not very many organisms, a very harsh ecosystem, but even a harsh ecosystem where there are some living organisms is an ecosystem. Okay, so we're now on to our next key term. Now for this one, you shouldn't have to look in your keynotes. Okay, so your next key term you should know already. So within an ecosystem, there will be a range of different species. So what is that species definition that you know? Okay, so you can pause me if you want. I want you to squiggle it down. All right, so it should match mine now when I reveal it. Okay, here's your definition. A species is a group of closely related individuals which are capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. If that is the definition you've got, well done. Okay, if it isn't, correct it and get it so that is the perfect definition that comes back, because that one does come up time and time again for 1 mark, and we don't want to miss a mark point for a definition. Okay, so one new definition and one we already knew. So now we're going to move on to some other new definitions. Okay, so population. A population is all the individuals of one species, okay, that live together in one habitat at one time. So they are a group of organisms that are able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So that's a species. That's why we use that keyword in this definition. It's important that it's there. And you can see from my pictures, I've got a few different populations there. Okay, so they're individuals of one species that live in that place, that habitat at that one time. So there's something that we measure. Our next definition is community. A community of organisms is defined as all the populations of different organisms living and interacting in a particular place at the same time. Now, in terms of the AQA mark schemes, the most important thing about that definition is that it is all the populations of different organisms. Okay, so a community is all the, if you want to use the same sort of definition as your population, it's all the populations of all the species living together in that area at that time. And I've used area at that time a number of times now, so interchangeable for the term habitat. So that's the place where a community of organisms lives, or a place where a population of organisms lives. So they won't really ask you to define this because it's a little bit too easy to define the place where organisms live, but you will be expected to use the word habitat, and the examiner will use the word habitat as well, and so it's important you know what it means. Okay, so we're now going to think about factors that affect organisms' distribution. Okay, so I've used the key terms biotic and abiotic all the way through this video, so I'm hoping we've picked up on the idea that abiotic are non-living and biotic are living factors. Okay, so you can see this now in your keynotes as well. So abiotic factors, what do you think that includes? Biotic factors, what do you think that includes? Do you want to write down your ideas? Okay, should we have a review? Should we see what you've got? Okay, so abiotic then are the non-living factors within an ecosystem. So things like temperature, water availability, oxygen availability, inorganic ion concentration in the soil, pH of the soil, light intensity, light availability, and the list can go on. On the biotic side, the living factors, that's not quite as long. Okay, we've got competition. Okay, now competition can happen between two different species. Okay, so you can have competition between two different species for the same resources, and that would affect the number of each of those populations. So if one was a better competitor than the other, then its numbers would be higher, forcing the other species numbers to go lower. Okay, so we get that interaction between different species as competitors, but we also have intraspecific competition, and that's competition between individuals of the same population. So they're the same species, live in the same population, they live together, and they're in competition for the same resources. So both of those are biotic factors, as is grazing. Okay, so that's when animals are eating plants, predation, so it's animals eating animals, and disease, because they're caused by living organisms too. Okay, so I'd like you to pause the video now, and I'd like you to have a go at sorting the abiotic and biotic factors. So you could just have a little list going, or you can just put the numbers into categorize them and use the numbers to record. Okay, so you should have done the task and you should be back with me. So we're going to do a bit of a review. Okay, so I'm just going to record A for abiotic and B for biotic. So water pH, what did you have? Should be abiotic. Interspecific competition was biotic. Parasites, because they're other living organisms, that's another example of a biotic factor. Length of exposure to the air or submersion, which is a factor that affects a lot of seaweed species, is an abiotic factor. The light intensity or the duration of the light, again, an abiotic factor. Availability of oxygen in a rock pool, abiotic. Predators, biotic. Availability of food. Okay, we'll come back to that one in a minute. Disease, we said definitely a biotic factor. Water temperature, it's got to be a physical factor in the environment. Height above sea level, again, a physical factor, abiotic. Intraspecific competition for a resource, biotic factor. Aspect you might not have got because you might not know what the key term means. If you ever watched quite a lot of sort of house buying programs, one of the ways someone showing a house around might describe the house is that it's got a nice aspect. So it's like position. So you can be north facing or south facing, and that's the aspect. Okay, so that has a big impact for organisms. So if you're south facing, then you will have more sunlight and it'll be warmer, for example. So that is an abiotic factor. Wave action, so that's how the crashing of waves against rocks, the rocky shore. If you're on an exposed bit of rock, then there'll be more wave action. That's abiotic. And the presence of toxic chemicals is physical, so it is abiotic. So that just leaves us with food availability. Okay, so food availability, food is something that is consumed. Okay, so animals consume their food, okay, because they're heterotrophic. And so this is the availability of plants that herbivores eat or animals that carnivores eat. So food availability is a biotic factor. Okay, so it's always another organism that is being eaten as a food source. So how did you do? I'm hoping close to 15 out of 15. Super work. Okay. Can you turn to the back of your student notes and can you please answer these two questions now with your new knowledge on biotic and abiotic factors? Can you put examples in there too? Okay, pause me and then come back and we'll check your answers together. Okay, so you should have your answers now. So an abiotic factor, the first thing you should have written is it's a physical factor that affects the distribution of organisms, okay, of an organism within a habitat. So it's a physical factor. So in terms of examples, you might have the pH of the soil, the dissolved oxygen concentration of a pond water source, the water availability in soil, the light intensity or duration of light in whatever scenario, in a forest or something. So you've got lots of different things you can write about that are physical factors. Okay, so what's meant by biotic factor? So a biotic factor is a living factor that affects the distribution of organisms within an ecosystem. So that's what you should have for your definition. And then examples are inter and intra-specific competition, predation, you can have food availability, you can have parasites and disease. Okay, right. Okay, so moving on to our final definition. I'm looking now for us to explore niche. Now, as you can see from your keynotes, you've got a definition of niche. And what I want you to do is to use that definition and the information on the next slide to explain why you think these two seabirds can live in the same ecosystem, in the same place within it. Okay, so pause me while you have a good look at the information. The question that I want you to think about are questions at the bottom. What will happen here, and how will these species affect each other, if at all? Okay, so now you've taken some time to think about your niche definition. We want to explore it. Okay, so a niche describes where an organism lives and what it does, its role. And that includes what it feeds on and how it interacts with other organisms and the environment. Okay, so let's take this first seabird. Okay, so the first seabird, if we look at where it lives, it lives on the broad cliff edges and obviously goes to catch its food in the sea. Okay, now that looks like our second seabird lives in a similar habitat within that ecosystem. Look, on the cliff edges and also feeds in the sea. So we might at first, if we just consider where they live, their habitats, think there's some overlap in their habitats. Okay, but niche is more than where the organism just lives. So if you go back to that definition, it describes where it lives and what it does, its role. And that includes what it eats and where it eats and when it eats. Okay, so let's compare the feeding part of the niche of these two organisms. Okay, so the first seabird is a bottom feeder. So it eats mainly flatfish and prawns in the shallow water, the estuaries and the harbours. Whereas the second bird dives into the water for fish. So they're actually feeding on different organisms, so they won't be in competition for food. So although there may be some competition for nesting sites in terms of their habitat, they don't eat the same food source. Okay, so their impact on each other is quite minimal. There's some interaction as they live in the similar parts of the cliff, but they aren't going to have a significant effect on the other's numbers. Okay, so the reality is no two species can occupy the same niche. Okay, wherever there is any overlap of niches, there is competition between species. So two species could never occupy the same niche. What would happen is one of those two species would be a better competitor and would outcompete the other completely. So in reality, these two birds are very different. If we think about our second bird here, we said that it goes further out to sea. It's actually diving for fish and eels. So they're very, very different in their feeding behaviours, where they feed and what they feed on, which means they can both be very successful in the same ecosystem, as they're not in direct competition with each other, as their niches do not completely overlap. Okay. So you've got that example in your keynotes too, okay? And what we want to do is to explore that a little bit more now. Okay, so this diagram illustrates what would happen if there was an overlap of niche between two different species. So if two species are in competition, so perhaps some element of the niche does overlap, over time, the better competitor will outcompete the other for that particular resource. Okay, so if there is an interaction between two species and they're competing for the same resource because there is some overlap between some element of their niche, then you will see that that niche trims for one organism as the other outcompetes it. Okay, so the examiner isn't really interested in you just recalling the definition of niche, because it's far more interesting to see you use it. Okay, so they're more likely to give you a data set and to say, how does this data set illustrate that these organisms occupy different niches? And they're usually unfamiliar situations that you've never seen before. Okay, so you're applying your understanding of the niche definition. So remember, organisms occupy different niches because the niche is not just where they live, but also their role, what they eat, when they eat, and the other interactions with other organisms. So think about everything that might be in the niche of an organism. So it might be, it's definitely going to include where it lives, its habitat, it might include its food sources, as we've seen with the birds, but also things like abiotic resources it might need. Okay, the way in which it is influenced by abiotic factors, so like its maximum and minimum temperatures that it requires for survival. It may be the way it interacts with other individuals of the same species and with individuals of other species as well. So, big term, lots to explore. How's the examiner going to assess you? Okay, here is an example. We have got some data in front of you. I'm going to ask you to pause the video and have a go at answering this question using your knowledge on your own. So the table shows the average size and the branch position of fruit eaten by 4 species of fruit pigeons on an island. Okay, never heard of it. We don't know anything about pigeons. Now, remember, in year 13, when you're given data sets, you're given multiple bits of data. And just because you're given data, sometimes you don't really need it. Okay, so try to zone in on what would be important things within the niche of these organisms. Okay, so where do they live and what do they eat? Okay, is there any overlap between the niches of any of these species, or are they separate? Now, if we're going to use the data, the examiner wants you to actually quote back from the data. Okay, we're going to be explaining the term niche. So you put your definition down, but that's not going to get you any marks. You're going to have to use it then to explain how these different organisms from this data are in their own niche. Okay, so where they eat, where they might live in the same place, do they eat something differently from each other? Okay, so pause me there and then we'll go through. Okay, So hopefully you've had some time to have a go at this. So first of all, you're going to get a mark point for your definition. Okay, so I've just written niche is the role of a species within its community. Okay, the idea that the examiner is looking for is the idea of its role. Okay, so where it lives and what it does would be equally valid. So if you put our definition where the organism lives and what it does, you would get a mark point, including what it feeds on and its interactions with other organisms, so its role. Okay. There was an extra detail mark available for including food source on this mark scheme. It was an old specification mark scheme though, so we might not get the mark point now. Okay. So, but I will give it you today. So if you've said including what it eats, when it eats, etc. Now, the next bit is really important. This is the crux of what you're trying to always illustrate to the examiner. If you're using data to illustrate the term niche, you are trying to show that no two species in that table can occupy identical niches. So they can't be identical in their niche. There may be a little bit of overlap in one factor, but they will not be identical. Because remember, no two species can occupy exactly the same niche. Okay, so key things we should have recognised. Well, there are 4 pigeon species, okay, and they all eat fruit. However, they all eat different size fruit, okay, and they're in different positions on the branches. So they eat fruit of different sizes on different positions in the branches. This means that there's a reduction in competition. They don't eat from the same place or fruit of the same size, therefore that aspect of their niche does not overlap. Okay, now you will not on the new specification get all of your mark points unless when you're asked to use data that you've quoted the data. So here where you've got different size fruits and different positions, you need to expand that and you need to have the name of the bird, and that lives in the same place as another bird, and then how they differ in their size of fruit. Okay. Okay, so for example, I might go for pigeon B that eats fruit found on the middle upper side branch, the middle of the upper, middle up. You might think it was in competition with pigeon C, which also feeds from the middle of the branch, but then I'd say, however, the average diameter of the fruit consumed by B was 25 millimeters compared to a much smaller average diameter for C, which is 8 millimeters. So therefore they might have some overlap in where they are eating the fruit, but they're eating fruit of different sizes. So I'm quoting the data. That would be stronger. Okay, so I wouldn't give myself those 2 mark points unless I'd extracted examples from the table in that way. Okay, time for a quick check of your definitions. So could you please copy down the table and put in your keyword? Pause me and then rejoin. Okay, so you should have completed the task now. So if we're going through these, let's tick them off. Okay, so the first one we're looking for is the role of an organism within the community. So that's going to be our niche. Non-living factors such as temperature that affect the distribution of living organisms, they are our abiotic factors. All the living organisms in a defined area. Now you might have struggled with that one a little bit because it's a different way of saying what we said. So all the living organisms, now that's all the different species. Okay, so that's got to be community. Can you see why I've gone for that one? Because a community, we said, was all the individuals of all the different species living together in that area at that time. So that would be all the living organisms in that area at that time. That's your community. The total number of species living in a defined area. Okay, so what did we say number of species was a measure of? Okay, so this is a measure of species richness. Okay. The place where an organism lives is, of course, its habitat. And finally, a technique for measuring the influence of an environmental gradient on organisms. Okay, that one you would have to have looked up because we've not covered it. So it's called topography if you've done a little bit of research, but it is part of what you do with ranging poles if you've done this in geography. Okay, we don't tend to do that anymore. Okay, so moving on then to our next slide. Okay, at the back of your keynotes, you've got a number of definitions now to finish off. Okay, now one we haven't looked at yet is carrying capacity. Okay, so carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals within a population. So if you think about your population within your ecosystem, if there are a massive number of resources available, then that population size will increase and will be much bigger than another ecosystem where the same resources are not available. Okay, so carrying capacity is the maximum number that that population can grow to within the ecosystem. So in other words, limited by the resources that are available. We can come back to that one, or you can write it in now. It's up to you. Okay, so pause me and come back. Okay, so just a quick review. So population, all the individuals of the same species living in the same habitat at the same time. And remember, because of the same species, they can potentially interbreed with each other. Community, all the populations of all the different species. So you can say all the living organisms, all the populations living in that habitat at that time. Ecosystem, all living organisms, their interaction with each other and the environment. Ecosystems, remember, can range from small to large. You don't need that for your definition, but it's a bit of extra information you can pop in there. Okay, so here is your specific definition for carrying capacity. So we will come back to carrying capacity when we start measuring population size. So it is the maximum number of population, a population is supported by the environmental resources within that ecosystem. So it's the maximum number that population can reach supported by the environmental resources. And finally, explain the advantage of species occupying different niches. Okay, so this is the other question the examiner asks. So other than giving you some data and saying use the data to explain the key term niche or to illustrate the key term niche, the other thing they do is flip it on its head and they say, what's the advantage that no two species ever occupy the exact same niche? And it's because as soon as they do, there's competition. Okay, so in exam questions, they ask this all the time. We're going to have a look at an example soon. So less competition for food and other resources is usually going to get you a mark point. Sometimes you need to, well, you do need to name the resources related to the exam question, but food is generally always one of them. Okay, so let's have a look at some exam questions. So can I ask you to get your question pack? We're going to do question 1 in the question pack. I'd like you to do all parts of 1. Stop the video, do the questions, and then review with me. Okay, so question 1, what's meant by the term population? Now I'm going to bring mark schemes up now, and you can see that if you've used your definitions from your keynotes, they're equivalent to the mark schemes. Okay, so all the individuals of one species in that area at that time. Give it a tick if you've got that. What about community then? So that's all the groups of species. Now can you see the different ways the examiner's letting people write this? It could be all the living organisms in that area, all the groups of species in that area, all the populations in that area, and of course that all means the same thing, so they have to accredit it. Okay, so choose your definition and then just stick with it. Just when you're marking your own work at home and you're looking at your definitions, if they're equivalent level, they say the same thing, then you can give yourself the credit. But if they don't say the same thing, then you can't. Yeah, they have to be exactly the same words, but the same level of communication. Okay, so now the next one. So this is this example I was telling you about. So scientists investigate the distribution of three fish species in a lake. They record the range of depths at which they're found. Okay, so use the information from the table to give the different depths at which the 3 species may be found together. So we're looking for the overlap in where they live, basically. Okay, so if you worked out the overlap within those ranges, it was 7.2 to 8.4 meters. You could have given the difference. You're allowed to take 7.2 from 8.4 and give the difference as well. Okay, so here's this question I was talking about. Suggest and explain one advantage of the fish occupying different depths in the lake. So they haven't said different niches, but it's, you know, that's what they're talking about. Okay, so by being in different niches, we've got this idea that there's less or no competition, and the things they accepted in this question, because these were fish, was for food, or prey is a different way of saying food. Yeah, the fish are eating other small fish, etc. And oxygen, because they need to be able to absorb oxygen for respiration excuse me, across the gill surface. This is an old spec question. On the new specification, both of those would be clubbed together. So if you had to give that answer, you'd only get 1 mark point for it. So they might ask for 2 and then you'd explain both of them. Okay, so less competition for food and less competition for oxygen in the water. Okay, now we've practiced this style of question, and at the back of your keynotes there is a revision question based on this. So back of your keynotes in your student revision questions, it says you're given a graph showing a correlation, you're asked to evaluate this statement, X causes Y. How do you structure your answer? Okay, now this is a key structure that we have always been talking about in class. So if you're asked to evaluate, then you must structure your answer in 4 steps. You must give the correlation, but say it doesn't have a causal link or doesn't mean there's a causal link. Give another factor that could impact the trend. Give data that doesn't support the correlation, and then question the sample size and methodology. Okay, so you do what's appropriate within that to the question. So, having a look at this question, the graph shows the relationship between the depth and the temperature of the water. The student concluded that the temperature of the lake, the water in the lake, determined the depth at which the species of fish were found. Use the table and the graph to evaluate this conclusion. Okay, so the thing is, in this case, like quite often on our new specification, you've got 2 data sets to consider. So you have to think about your table at the same time. Okay, so although we've got some information here in the table, the graph, that suggests that as you increase your depth, the temperature is lower. Okay. We've also got information in the table that says that some species of fish occupy quite a large length of depths, okay, which obviously are different temperatures. So having a look then at what the examiner wants in your answer. Okay, so you've got here 1 mark point for looking at your graph here. So increase in depth is linked to the temperature. So you can say there's a correlation relationship between that. Okay, but a correlation between the temperature and the fish distribution doesn't indicate a causal effect. Okay, so it looks like that could be truth, but it doesn't mean it's going to be a causal effect. And in fact, when you look at the data, there's a range of the different fish species occupy the same depth. Yeah, so the ranges overlap. So it can't be temperature determine the distribution there at that particular depth. So it could be then another factor. So we might think about food sources, for example. So it may not be that temperature is the abiotic factor that affects the distribution of those fish within the depths of the water. It might be where the food source is found, which is why they occupy those different depths. Can you see if you'd have used the structure that we advise you to use for evaluation questions, you would have worked your way through picking up those mark points. Okay, update your answer and pause here if you haven't done it already. We're going to move on now. Okay, so we've got question 4 in your question pack. If you pause here, obviously I can see the mark schemes there, just ignore the mark scheme, have a go at the question and then pop back. Okay, so we've got mountains are harsh environments. The higher up a mountain, the lower the temperature becomes. The diagram shows the forest growing on one side of the mountain. The upper boundary of the forest is the tree line. Trees do not grow above that. It says the position of the tree line is determined by abiotic factors. What's an abiotic factor? So I'm hoping you've written a non-living factor that affects the distribution of species or organisms, and you would have picked up your first mark point. Other than temperature suggests an abiotic factor that would be likely to affect the position of the tree line on the mountain. So you're allowed anything that you think would affect basically growth or photosynthesis of a tree. So you can have any named soil factor, but you do have to say in the soil. So you have to say pH of the soil, nitrate concentration of the soil, light intensity really, or availability, so duration of light, carbon dioxide concentration, oxygen concentration, the incline or aspect. So aspect, remember, is whether it's on the north or the south side of the mountain. The incline is how steep the mountain is. Both of those will be valid. And wind speed. Okay.